Welcome to Things I Wish I Knew. This is a podcast from Thinking Faith, a work of the Jesuits in Britain. I'm Julia, I'm in my early 30s, and I'm living in a young adult community in London from the Jesuits. So this podcast is about how we all live our hectic lives, and often we don't get time to reflect on what's happening both to us and around us. So this is a moment to stop and think about where you're at, where you're going, and where your relationship with God fits into it all. So every week I'll meet a new guest who tells me about something they've experienced which has changed their life. And by talking about the things they wish they'd known, at the time we'll explore the idea that God is in all things. Talk about that part that faith plays in navigating life challenges. So today I'm speaking to Jack. And Jack is really open about how he lost his mum in the last 10 years and how that's really impacted him. And he speaks about how to help someone in grief. Jack is also living in the Jesuit young adult community. And I met Jack for the first time when he was 18, soon after he'd lost his mum. Jack, now that you're 28 and 10 years after you lost your mum, what do you wish you'd known?
I wish I'd known that the really big thing is that it wasn't a full stop. I think I ended up viewing my life as split into two halves by that event, by mum dying. I was 18 and 1 month. So it was a really weird time of transition for me. So I'd left the school where I'd been for 10 years. It was a boarding school, but I was a day pupil. So my support group of peers, they burst around the globe back to where they came from. So I was leaving school, mum died. I was also leaving the sort of rhythm of Catholic life that school instilled in us. And then a couple of years later, when I began actually processing the event of what happened, the trauma, I reinvented in my head that this was life starting again. So I viewed all of my friendships, all of my even sort of thoughts and desires, what I wanted out of life, I viewed that as starting from that point. And one of the things I've really come to realize in the last couple of years is that's a lie. It wasn't a breaking event. I wasn't reinventing myself. I wasn't being new. I was actually continuing from that person. And in many ways, I'd rejected and pushed back a lot of that. And that wasn't a healthy thing to do. And I've actually been sort of, in many ways, rediscovering who I was before that event now.
Interesting you're saying about that pushing back, because as I think we've talked about many times, is that we initially met when I was doing my master's and you were doing your undergraduate. And then there's this sudden gap in our friendship. And then suddenly 3 years later or something, when you graduated, you came back into my life. So where do you think that kind of gap came from? Because I think, and this is not me having a go at you, just to clarify, but I remember trying to reach out to you thinking, oh, we were good friends, let's stay in contact. But very quickly got the impression from you that you had no interest in that.
Yes. Nothing personal, I assure you. So I think that was me in many ways repeating a trauma response that I had developed. As I said, when mum died, I was, in this moment of transition. And then for most of the next year after that, before I went to university, because I had to retake some A-levels, because having a parent dying is not the best place to be when you're taking your A-levels the first time, I was sort of going through a period where I was almost in a daze, I think. I wasn't really processing anything. I was functioning, and that was about as good as it got for that first year. And then suddenly I was packed off to university. And in many ways, that wasn't an active choice, I don't think. It was my dad coming to me and saying, right, you can't just do nothing. What's next? And I ended up in Aberystwyth. And there was a new life in that, being, meeting new people and new things, and a desire to hold on to that new life because it was better than the pain that I was feeling but not recognizing and not allowing myself to feel. So I held on quite tightly to those around me. But at the same time, when my mum died, there was a couple of friends who reached out to me. But 18-year-olds are not best equipped to cope with the grief themselves or support their friends, especially if you're not, close physically to one another. And I had gotten into a thought process in my head of, my primary caregiver had gone, and you don't really know what forever is until someone you love has died, because suddenly that becomes very real. And my support network wasn't there. And I ended up in the thought space of thinking, well, whenever someone is away, whenever they've moved out of my close area, then in some ways they don't exist. In some ways you risk hurting yourself if you try and hold on to them too tightly. So what's the point? Why would I expend my effort in that? And obviously now I recognize that as a very negative thought process, especially when a couple of years after university, I ended up living in Birmingham, and Aberystwyth as a university town, I found a very nurturing place. When I was an adult in Birmingham, suddenly I was in a place with no proximate friends again. And I realized that I really need those relationships, and that pushing them away too often and too far is actually a very harming way of living. And as an adult, you can't do that. As an 18-year-old, I thought it was the right thing to do. But at this point in my life, I've realized that actually distance in friendships is, as adults, that's what happens. You move around the country, you lose people. And just because they're not there doesn't mean they are out of your life. I had pushed everyone away, and sort of realizing that was actually an act of self-harm, because I suddenly became face to face with the fact that I didn't have people around me. And that wasn't their fault. That was my fault, because I was sort of nurturing my pain and keeping it away from everyone, not willing to share that. And in doing so, because it was so huge, I was almost sort of turning my back on people to focus on myself. So that was a sort of coming to that realization in that year was partly because I was faced with that issue. I think also partly it was time, and it was starting to hurt less, and I was starting to grow. Sort of, there's a thing in grief circles, which is that the grief never changes; it stays the same size, but you grow around it. And after 7 years since my mum died, I was sort of getting into a position where I was growing around it and able to sort of bear it better. And that gave me an opportunity to be introspective a bit and realize that this was a negative area. There was also at that time a podcast starting called The Griefcast, which I would highly recommend for anyone going through grief or knowing people who do. And it's a conversation between the amazing Carrie Lloyd and a guest about their grief. And hearing those stories each week made me realize that what I was feeling was all right. Pain is not necessarily a bad thing when it comes to missing people. And that really helped me sort of be more open about talking about it and realizing this is not something to be ashamed of. This is not something to hide from the world. This is something just to embrace and take with me into my friendships, because I had never talked about it with friends at all. It was an intensely private thing. And by keeping it private, that was harming me and leading me to harm other relationships. And not just with friends, but my relationship with God was negatively impacted by me sort of keeping all of this inside and bottled up. So that year marked a moment of transition. And I think it was partly luck that did that. But that year of transition wouldn't have, I don't think, led me to where I am now if it wasn't for the last 2 years where I've been living in a Jesuit community of young adults where we are encouraged to engage in spiritual direction. And my spiritual director is a fantastic nun who lives in South London. And there is something very helpful about describing your relationships with your friends, about describing what you're doing in your life, and have someone ask, where's God in that? Where is God in that friendship? Because you've said, Jack, that you are aware that you push people away, that you are now aware that you've harmed these friendships. Where is God calling you to act in that space? And that really made me think, actually, I've been listening to the bad spirit. I've been pushing away the consoling spirit of God, and I've been indulging indulging myself, wallowing in this pain a bit. And that really helped me see next steps. This is the harm, this is the damage, what's next? And if I hadn't had that, I think I would have been left in a situation where I was aware of my pain and aware of the harm it was causing, but not knowing what next, not knowing how to react to that. The next step is trying to be better with my friends, with those around me, trying to be more intentional in my relationships. I think really a lot of the last decade I have spent running on autopilot. I've not engaged in my friendships in an intentional way. I've just sort of lived it without thinking it. And in many ways, that's something that grief has. People react to grief in different ways. And I've seen some young people have a real zest for life, for partying in, for engaging in, all of the sort of risky, exciting bits of life. And other people, and I think myself included, just disengaged and pulled back from taking ownership of that life and just rolling with it. I think that is my next step, and it's a journey, and it's something that I'm not doing brilliantly in some places and I'm doing better in others, of trying to intentionally see, okay, this is a person I value in my life, and they are going away, they're having their own families. How do I let this person know I value them? How do I sort of maintain the reciprocality of our relationship? How do I avoid just throwing my hands up and saying, right, they're going away, that's that? Because, I used to think they're moving away, they're having their own life. That's them moving away. They're the one who's leaving. And actually it was me who was just letting them go. Yeah. So that's my next step.
I want to go back to a point where you were saying about being 18 and not having friends that got in contact with you, but you didn't know how to be supportive and they didn't know how to be supportive. Because, and this is, rarely do I give a compliment to you, Jack, but this is one thing I definitely will compliment in you. I think you are one of the best people who knows how to be there for people during their time of grief. So I've seen it with a mutual friend we had who lost a parent, and I've seen it with a friend of yours who, when they lost a parent, you went and be there. I think and we were talking about this with our housemates the other day about, for a lot of people who've not experienced it, grief, or maybe have experienced it from younger when they were grandparents, they just don't know how to react when somebody says they've lost someone close to them. What do you think is the best advice in how to deal with that situation so you don't just end up going, I'm sorry for your loss?
I'm sorry for your loss, or you have my condolences, is as good as you can give, really. I vividly remember 4 individuals soon after my mum died. One who I really learnt from was someone who was a couple of years above me in my school. So he'd left, he'd gone off to university or whatever by this point, and he'd heard that my mum had died. Because I didn't put it up on social media immediately, but I think when it came to her funeral a couple of weeks later, I might have put something up then. And he sent me a message, and I had said, I've almost copied and pasted it the few times that I've known people who've then lost people, because he had lost a parent when he was younger too. And his message basically broke down into, you might not remember me, here's who I am. I once felt like this too. So I think he phrased it actually as, I don't understand how you are feeling, but I have felt something like this when my parent died. And there is one of the key things that has helped me process this as I've grown older is the increasing awareness that I am not alone and that everyone will go through grief at some point in their life. It's not an unnatural thing. And I think when I was 18, I didn't process his message. I just thought, oh, it's a message. But looking back, that has been a key moment of someone just reaching out and saying, you are in an awful situation. There's no getting around that. This is awful. It's going to be awful for a couple of years. But I've been there too. It's not exactly the same, but I've been there. And I'm okay now. So I think his reaching out was, key to how I react to friends experiencing the same thing today. The other was a friend's girlfriend who I'd never had much time never spent much time with, who out of the blue gave me a call. And I'd never had a phone call with her in my life. I'd never really spoken to. And the thing that really hit me about that was it wasn't my friend who reached out. It was his girlfriend who reached out. I imagine he just had absolutely no idea what to say. And she didn't really know what to say. She just reached out quite blindly in many ways because I hadn't shared details of the situation. And she just reached out to say, I'm really sorry. I'm really sorry. She wasn't living in the country, so she couldn't go, I'll be around with a shepherd's pie. As I often hear advice from grief groups of do something practical for them. I'm not a practical person. So for me, I think learning that, it does take some bravery just to reach out to someone who must be in pain because there's a voice inside you saying, oh, you don't want to disturb them or you don't want to be an inconvenience. Maybe do it in a couple of months when they're better. I mean, a couple of months later, they're not going to be better, but you feel, give them time and space. But actually, just having a friendly voice reach out and say, and in many ways, we used to do this better because the Victorians used to have mourning notepaper. So you had notepaper in a black border and you would send it to someone and there was a recognition in that of this person's in pain and I'm reaching out. And you can do that in a variety of ways. But this friend did it through a phone call. And I'm actually forever grateful that she did that because it made me feel recognized at a time when all of my other friends didn't really know what to say. And as good as a comment on a Facebook post, oh, I'm so sorry, Jack. That was nice. But actually that personal reaching out was really impactful to me. The other thing the third person who stands out was a teacher and her children. And I knew her children went to the same school as me. They came to Mum's funeral. They didn't need to. It helped that the funeral was at the chapel at the school. So it was nearby. It's where they lived. But, they didn't have to come to that. And that's the other lesson I've learned is that if I can at all possible, if someone I care about has lost someone close to them, I will try and go to that funeral. I won't know the person who's died. I've got no connection to them apart from through this friend. But I'm not there. I am there to sort of commemorate this person's life, but I'm there to support my friend. Because on a day when you are so overwhelmed, for most of the last 10 years, I've not really been able to remember the day of my mum's funeral because I pushed that memory down because it hurt. And I learned a lot from talking to her friends at the reception afterwards, the wake. But, having a friend there, having that friendly face, I might have spoken to them for 2 minutes out of that entire day, but knowing that there was a friendly face that wasn't there for my mum, but was there for me, I found incredibly consoling. And the fourth person who I vividly remember was my then best friend who played the organ for Mum's funeral. And I'm very grateful that she did that. And weirdly, I have no idea how she thought what she thought I was doing. But at the reception afterwards, I would talk to someone who knew Mum, chat. And then I'd almost used her as a sort of lodestone of where to go back to. And I needed that during that day, because I feel if I had just had a day of people talking at me about mum, that would have been overwhelming. I don't know how I would cope with that these days. Now I'm 10 years older. God willing, it'll be another 20 years before I have to go to another parent's funeral. And I suppose as an adult, you can cope better. But when I was 18, having that one person who was there, who I could talk to about not this situation, that was incredibly useful. So everything I've learned from that has basically been, don't be afraid to reach out to someone. They are in pain, and recognize that pain. And if you can empathize with it, if you felt it yourself, let them know that they're not alone. And if possible, show that physically by being there. And I've also found that, although this has been a more recent thing, I think you mentioned that we had a mutual friend who had lost a parent. I was much closer to my own grief at that point. And I don't think I've done that. I've been as good. But more recently, I've had a friend who lost a parent. And I feel that now I'm that much further away from my own grief, that I can be more present to them as they experience their own. Never saying, oh, you'll get over it, because you won't. Never saying that this is wrong. But however they feel it, even if it's different from me, it's right that they're feeling it. And just sort of being someone who they can talk to about it. I don't know how they feel, but I certainly felt that no one else in the world knew what I was feeling. So being someone who they can talk to is probably one of the greatest gifts I got out of this whole experience, because everyone needs someone like that. And if I can do that, then that's a blessing. There is, when you talk to people about their loss, there's an instinct, I think, to talk to them about themselves. How are you feeling? How are you doing? And that is important, don't get me wrong. But you don't process your pain if you're being asked, how's your pain? How's your pain? How are you feeling? How is all of that? I found I processed it when I had opportunities to talk about my mum. So when I was able to have a conversation with someone who wasn't going, well, how is your pain? How are you feeling? They were instead going, tell me a story. You know, there's a group for people who are grieving under 30. I went to one of their meetings recently. This friend who had lost their parent more recently than I had. And it's amazing actually how in the last 10 years there's been an upswell of groups for people feeling grief as a young adult, which I don't think were around 10 years ago, or if they were, I just wasn't plugged into them. And there was 3 of us wandering around Hyde Park, and the vast majority of that conversation wasn't about us. It was about the people that we'd lost. Because that's how you begin to process the pain. Because in many ways, there's sort of a gap or a wound in the shape of this person in your life. And you've got to get used to that. And ignoring it doesn't help that. Ignoring it, it's still there, and it will get you at some point. You can't ignore grief for long. It will find a way. So I really felt my grief over my mum for the first time when I broke up with a girlfriend. Like, completely unrelated. I broke up with this person. I was distraught. We'd not been together long. And looking back, all of that emotion wasn't coming from that breakup. It was coming from the grief that I hadn't processed and addressed. And it was just hitting me in a different way. By spending time talking about the person that you've lost. So we spent a time talking about, what in your life now comes to you from them? And there's a lot of the way that I think about the world, how I am disorganized and very nerdy. I get that from my mum. And, if you don't recognize that, then in many ways you're dishonoring their legacy. And it hurts to think about that, but in a good way, if that makes sense. It's a conversation you don't really want to have. So the first 20 minutes of this walk was just awkward small talk. And, all of us knowing we came here to talk about the people we've lost and the pain we're feeling. And none of us wants to start that conversation. We don't want to be the person to talk about it. But actually, once we did start talking about it, it was a really cathartic feeling. I've mentioned it before of how important realizing you're not alone is. Because this is, in many ways, a really intensely private thing. Because your relationship to the person you've lost, no one really knows that. Even if you have siblings, their relationship to the parent will be different than yours. And so recognizing that you aren't alone in it, recognizing that how you feel is all right. So there was a really challenging couple of years where I felt immense guilt because my mum had been ill for about 5 years. And the final couple of months, she'd been very ill. I mean, if you're dying, obviously you're going to be very ill. But she was very ill in an uncomfortable way. So she had a brain tumor and she had to be maneuvered in hoists and wheelchairs and all sorts, which she found incredibly distressing. And one of the feelings that I felt after she died was relief that it was over. And that made me feel incredibly guilty because my brain, the bad spirit in the back of my head was saying, you shouldn't be feeling that. You should not be happy or relieved. That's evil that you're feeling that. And actually, that is a completely legitimate feeling to have. I mean, I'm a Christian, I'm a Catholic, so I believe she's gone on to a better place. How can I not be relieved? And in many ways, the church tells us to be relieved that, this person has gone on to their eternal reward. But I internalized that very negatively. And it wasn't until I was listening to other people on the Griefcast podcast where people were sharing their stories. And one episode, someone said that they'd felt that too. And suddenly there was a moment of clarity of, oh, hang on. The thing I've been beating myself up about for 2 years isn't as bad as I thought it was. So, that aspect of not being alone, I think as a Catholic, I treat it differently. So this grief group that I joined, I joined it. We were talking about, how long has it been? And for some people it was a couple of years. For me, it was 10. I was the oldest grief in the room, but I'm still processing it. So accepting that it's not going to be over quickly, you're still going to be processing it years from now. And I think that's also advice to people who are dealing with people in grief, rather than those going through grief themselves. Because, the Victorians had a year's mourning period. That was your official mourning period. Grief goes on beyond your calendar definition. You might think this person should be over it by now. They're not going to be. It's still going to be with them. So recognizing that your grief will last longer than you think it is, it's going to be a part of you. And if you don't accept that and address it as part of you, as something you're going to carry with you, so if you try and push it away or ignore it, then it'll come around and it'll bite you. But if you accept it and take it, then it can become a life-giving part of you. I now find talking about my loss, about my mum, about the last 10 years as actually a life-giving experience. I feel better having talked about it. When I talked about recognizing that my life has been a whole continuum rather than two halves divided by this trauma, I think maybe that has been a source of of growth for me it really started with my relationship with God. I'd identified that one of my major issues is not having, is pushing people away. And the nun who's my spiritual director said, well, do you do that with God? And I paused for about 5 minutes and said yes, because my relationship with God is very much reflective of my relationship with other people. And obviously there was a time, so from when my mum died to around when I met you, where I pushed the church away and my religion away and my faith away and God away. And then I've sort of reestablished that relationship in subsequent years. But at the same time, I never fully embraced God. I never had. So with Ignatian prayer, we're often told, speak to God as you would a friend. And I have never spoken to God as I would a friend. I've never been vulnerable with God until the last 2 years, which is mad because I've felt God's presence so close to me. And I know from my theological, I did a master's in theology. And from that, I've learned that we teach that God feels what you feel. And God became man so that, God has that context of knowing what it is to feel this as a human being. God knows that better than we know ourselves. And yet I would never, if I was feeling anxious or upset, I'd never share that with God because I didn't trust God not to be there. I would imagine that I would reach out to God and God wasn't there, but that's a load of rubbish. I think in many ways I've been rediscovering the childhood faith that I'd had, where you actually trust God with things. So I'd sort of ditched it and then rediscovered it as an adult. And, recognizing that God isn't something I've only found the last few years. There was a time as a child where I was, trusting. That's what I think I've got out of community in a real way.
So, Jack, we spoke about your next steps, but now I want to know, what next steps do you recommend for myself and our listeners?
Well, I think for those who are experiencing grief, I'd recommend, I've mentioned it before, the Griefcast podcast is a fantastic way of hearing other people's stories. Carrie Lloyd has recently released a fantastic book called You Are Not Alone, which is reflecting on her own discovery that you are not alone and her own, she lost a parent at quite a young age. There are also a couple of sort of Instagram groups that you can join. So there's a group called The Grief Case, and there's the Good Grief Trust, which is a sort of charity that gives advice on grief. And I think I was pointed in their direction when I was just 18. I didn't go there, but it was useful. And I think for anyone who, isn't experiencing a hard grief themselves, but wants to help people, I think there is a benefit to looking up these stories that I've just suggested because it gives you an insight. I would just say reach out to someone if you know anyone. And even if it's just a message saying, you're not alone, it's better than nothing.
Thanks for listening to Things I Wish I Knew. I know that this episode is going to stay with me because Jack is a good friend of mine and he talks about his own personal experience, but he also talks about how to support people and how to process grief. How about you? What's going to stay with you? We'd love to hear how Jack's story has resonated with you, and why not also tell us if you're facing an experience you wish you knew how to look at differently. It might just be something we can help with. Do write to me at jcorcoran@thinkingfaith and find out more about the themes we discussed today at thinkingfaith.org. Once again, thank you for listening, and I hope you join me again next time on Things I Wish I Knew.